Hello and welcome to the Turkish History Podcast. Episode 38. Welcome to Anatolia. Before we begin, if you have been enjoying this podcast, I'd like to ask you to please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get this podcast. It would mean a lot to me and would help more people find the podcast. Thank you for listening. So back to the narrative. Back to the story of the Turks. We spent the last 6 episodes outside the narrative, discussing the nature of the Great Seljuk Empire. And now, we're going to start what I'm calling informal Season 5 of the podcast, which will, of course, cover the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. But that also means we're not exactly picking up where we left off. Before we left the narrative, we covered the Great Seljuks through the reign of Melik Shah I and the splintering of the empire after his death. The end of al-Dawla al-Nizamiya and the golden age of the Great Seljuk Empire. But the story of the Sultanate of Rum actually begins before the end of the golden age of the empire. Indeed, it starts even before al-Dawla al-Nizamiya began. Instead, we're going to pick up after Manzikert. But instead of following Alparslan as he rides back to the east after the great battle, we're going to stay in Anatolia. In fact, it might be a good idea to re-listen to the episodes on the Nawakiya and Manzikert before listening to this episode, just to refresh yourself on what was happening in Anatolia. But before we begin, I'd like to set the stage for this season, and indeed for the foreseeable future of the podcast, at least until the expansion of the Ottoman Empire in like 100 episodes from now at the rate I'm going. Anatolia. See, to date, this podcast has been really expansive in geographic scope. We've spent time in China, the steppes of Inner and Central Asia, the lands of Transoxiana, Afghanistan, Iran, the Caucasus, Syria, Iraq, Egypt, and so on. But now, the geographic scope of this podcast is going to shrink dramatically as we zoom into Anatolia. So now, I thought it would be a good idea to spend some time describing the basic geography, the setting of the show. Anatolia is a roughly rectangular peninsula that juts out to the west from the bulk of Western Asia. I've often thought that it sort of looks like the long head of a cow or a rhino, but maybe that's just me. It actually sits on its own microtectonic plate, the Anatolian Plate, which means that the peninsula is basically ringed by fault lines. This, of course, leads to frequent earthquakes. Its coastline is ringed by mountains that rise up to a high plateau that takes up most of the peninsula. The plateau's elevation rises from west to east. In the west, the average elevation is a mere 600 meters, but ultimately, it rises to over 1,200 meters in the area near Sivas. In general, the land of the plateau is not particularly arable. The plateau itself does not receive a lot of rain, and particularly in its center and its west, it is instead dominated by grasslands. There are several places where endorheic basins have resulted in salt lakes. However, elsewhere, there are pockets of arable land, and a series of cities and villages do dot the plateau, but in general along its fringes, or else in the pockets of arable land. These include Ankara in the northwest center of the plateau, the current capital of Turkey, Kayseri, which used to be called Caesarea, in the southeast center, near the alien landscape and cave cities of Cappadocia, Sivas in the very east of the plateau, where the mountains again begin to rise upwards, and, absolutely critical for our story, Konya in the southwest center, along the mountains of the south. Once upon a time, Konya had been the Roman city of Iconium, and was a key mustering point for the Byzantine armies marching east. Incidentally, I'm going to generally stick with using Turkish names for places, even when that's a bit ahistoric. The very western part of the plateau is more hilly, and indeed more fertile, and hosts a number of towns and cities, among them Eskişehir, currently a university town, Kütahya, and Afyon, famous for its castle, perched on a steep mountain overlooking the city. To the northwest, of course, the mountains of the plateau drop off sharply into the Sea of Marmara, a small sea between the Aegean and Black Seas. Anatolia itself ends in what is now the Asian side of Istanbul, the neighborhoods of Üsküdar and Kadıköy, respectively called Chrysopolis or Scutari and Chalcedon in Greek. From here, you can of course see the great city of Constantinople across the Bosphorus, right on the European shore. But other cities are found in this part of Anatolia as you travel away from Constantinople. Further to the east, on the southern side of the peninsula that juts out towards Europe, lies the city of Izmit, Nicomedia in Greek. Once upon a time, this was the capital of the eastern half of the Roman Empire, before the founding of Constantinople. The climate in this region is continental, and the region is home to temperate forests and rich farmland. And as you pass the initial range of mountains south, you come to a city that will be very, very important to our story. Sitting on a lake just over the mountains from the Sea of Marmara, and incredibly close to both Izmit and Constantinople, lies the city of Iznik, or Nicaea in Greek. Famous during the Ottoman era for its fabulous tile workshops, and famous in the Byzantine era for the religious council held there, the Council of Nicaea. Iznik was at the time of the Turkish migrations the largest and most important city in this part of Anatolia, though eventually it would be eclipsed by nearby Bursa. Moving south and west from Iznik into the west of Anatolia, you pass the Dardanelles, the other great strait connecting the Aegean to the Marmara. This area is home to both the ancient city of Troy and, on the European side, the First World War battlefield of Gallipoli. As you move south down the Aegean coast, the mountains fall down from the plateau to the Aegean Sea in several east-west mini-mountain ranges. This leaves relatively easy passes to and from the plateau through long valleys, some quite meandering. Indeed, the word meander comes from the Greek name Menander for one of the rivers in this region, Menderes in Turkish. The climate transitions from a more continental climate to the classic Mediterranean climate of hot, dry summers and cool, damp winters. And the lands of these valleys are quite fertile, the most fertile land in all of Anatolia. The interior of this region therefore hosts a number of cities, most with ancient roots, from Manisa to Alaşehir, ancient Philadelphia, to Bergama, ancient Pergamum, to Aydın to Denizli. And between these cities, dotting the farmland, are many, many villages and towns of varying size. By contrast, the land along the coast itself is in general not particularly arable, and can be mountainous in parts. Nevertheless, along the coast there are still several cities and villages. Some are fishing villages, but larger cities serve as trade entrepot for the goods of Anatolia and indeed from all of Asia, to reach Constantinople, Greece, Italy, and the rest of Europe beyond. In our time, Izmir is of course the most important of these, but in the Roman and early Byzantine era, Ephesus was the largest before it was cut off from the sea due to changes in the coastline. Ephesus, of course, contains the Temple of Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and is today one of the top tourist sites in Turkey. The western coast of Anatolia becomes increasingly mountainous as you move south, particularly after today's Bodrum, called Halikarnassus in ancient Greek, and home to one of the other 7 wonders, the famous mausoleum. The coast then sort of makes a turn to the east after the spindly Datça Peninsula. The southern coast of Anatolia is extremely mountainous, with only small pockets of arable land clustered among the mountains, which is where most of the cities of the region can be found. These include Dalyan, home to the magnificent cave tombs of the kings of ancient Lycia, carved into the mountains near the sea, and today famous for its sea turtles. Further down the coast is Antalya, home to a beautiful waterfall pouring into the sea and a great Roman gate built by Hadrian. Today, it is famous for its golf courses. But beyond these settlements, the hinterland of the south is extremely mountainous, and it is sparsely populated, though it does contain excellent pasturages for animals in the high mountains. As you move further east, the Taurus Mountains give way to a pocket of flat arable land on the coast of the Mediterranean called Cilicia. Cilicia, of course, contains the famous Cilician Gates, one of the only good passes through the mountains onto the plateau. Today, the largest city in Cilicia is Adana, which contains an ancient Roman bridge over the river Seyhan and is today famous for its style of spicy kebab. Moving further east along the fringes of the plateau, you come to the borders of Syria. Here, the mountains of the plateau fall down into the deserts and semi-arid grasslands of southern Turkey and northern Syria. This region contains many of the cities that we have already discussed on the show: Antep, Urfa, Diyarbakir, and of course the cities of Mardin and Midyat, home to the best surviving Seljuk-era architecture in the world. Further to the north of these cities, the great mountains act like a wall, with very few good passes onto the plateau. In this region lie the cities of Malatya, today famous for its apricots, and Elazığ, cities that once upon a time guarded Anatolia from the first Arab armies of Islam and then the Turkish raiders. Moving north, we come to the east of the Anatolian Plateau. Here the plateau ends, as the mountains rise up from it into the Armenian highlands, which today are generally colloquially considered to be part of Anatolia. This is an area of mountains and highlands that rise up from the plateau to a general height of around 1,500 to 1,700 meters, but with some mountains that are much higher. This area is largely treeless and basically consists of mountains and hilly upland grasslands. In the winter, it is covered in deep snow. Within this region lie a series of important cities, usually found in either valleys containing arable farmland or along the rivers. These include Erzincan, Erzurum, and Kars. Along Lake Van, the great upland lake of the Armenian highlands, lies the city of Van. To the east is the towering twin-peaked Mount Ararat, today called Ağrı. Manzikert is of course nearby. To the north of the plateau, the mountains fall steeply into the Black Sea. Once upon a time called Pontus, this region is defined by sea, mountain, and dark, brooding forest. This is a land of deep valleys and tall mountains, and the north coast is mostly heavily wooded, with little farmland. Today, it is famous for producing tea and anchovies. Communities either live in the valleys, clinging to the slope of the steep mountains, or live in small pockets of suitable land along the coast of the Black Sea. The cities include the ancient Pontic Greek cities of Trabzon and Rize far to the east, and on the way back towards Constantinople in the west, Samsun and Amasra. In the interior, in the mountains above the sea, lie the ancient city of Amasya, once the city of the Mithridatic kings of Pontus, and home to their cave tombs, as well as the city of Safranbolu, famous for its preserved Ottoman architecture and saffron fields today, and Kastamonu, one of the most ancient cities in Anatolia, with a beautiful Byzantine castle. The climate along the Black Sea is oceanic, similar to the climate of the Pacific Northwest of North America, or much of the British Isles, wet and cool, with frequent light rain, fog, and mist, shrouding the tall mountains and dense forests. And of course, as you travel back west along the coast, you eventually come to Constantinople itself. So that is the land of Anatolia, today the homeland of the Turks, and the setting for much of this podcast going forward. It is an exceptionally diverse land, ranging from grasslands and steppes to temperate forests and farmland, from the gentle Mediterranean climate of the western and southern coasts to cold and snowy highlands in the east, from deserts in the south to cool and wet mountain forests in the north. and it is a land that has been home to many peoples throughout its history. The Hittites, the Lycians, the Carians, the Trojans, the Armenians, the Greeks, the Kurds, the Arabs, and now the Turks. Now, if you'll recall, Turkmen raiding of Anatolia actually started decades before Manzikert. In fact, it predated even the reign of Tughral. After the initial Seljuk defeat at the hands of Mahmud of Ghazna in 1029, a group of Turkmen called the Irakiya had rampaged around Iran and Iraq and raided into what is now southwestern Turkey. And then, after the rise of the Seljuks, Tughral had of course urged the Turkmen to go raid Anatolia, to get the wild tribes out of Iran as he consolidated power and built the Seljuk state. And ever since then, the Seljuk court had seen Anatolia as the perfect release valve for the tribes, a place where it didn't matter that the tribes were just going to rampage around, a place where that rampaging also helped to burnish the Seljuk dynasty's Islamic credentials by allowing them to present themselves as the prosecutors of jihad. And therefore, basically every year, Turkmen tribes would set out to raid Anatolia. Some of these invasions were led by the Seljuk court, such as Tughral's Kapatron campaign in 1048. But most were undertaken by the tribes themselves, with the Seljuk court basically telling the Romans that there was no way that they could stop it, all the while tacitly sanctioning and even encouraging it. This ultimately led to the emergence of wild Turkmen confederations on the fringes of the empire, in the lands of northern Syria and southern Anatolia, in particular the powerful Nawakiya Confederation. Indeed, one leading historian of the Sultanate of Rum, Alexander Byhammer, has argued that the basic underlying process here was the loss of imperial control over this zone of northern Syria and southern Anatolia, the region that lay on the border of the three great empires of the day, the Byzantine Empire, the Great Seljuk Empire, and the Fatimid Caliphate. And as the Seljuks strengthened and the Fatimids and the Byzantines weakened, none of the three empires were able to effectively exercise control over this zone. This resulted in the rise of local centers of power and what I called in our episode on the Nawakiya, the web of tension between the court in Cairo, the court in Constantinople, the Seljuk court of Alp Arslan, the Nawakiya nominally loyal to the Seljuks, and the Shia emirs of Aleppo, nominally loyal to the Fatimids. And these local power centers, the Nawakiya and the local emirs, very much played their own game, allying with each other and even with each other's patrons. The Nawakiya in particular hired themselves out to the emirs of Aleppo and even the Fatimid court, leading to growing fear and apprehension in the Seljuk court as the confederation grew more powerful. And from this zone of instability, the Nawakiya launched devastating raids of Byzantine Anatolia, which, as we discussed, ultimately led to the rise of Emperor Romanos Theogenes. Upon the death of Emperor Constantine X in 1067, Empress Eudokia had come to power as regent. But in order to stop the constant raiding of the Turkmen, she had turned to the talented and charismatic general Romanos, marrying him and making him emperor in 1068 with a mandate to stop the Turks. Romanos then did his very best, taking the field each year and even campaigning deep into the frontier zone of northern Syria and southern Anatolia. This was only somewhat effective, and he couldn't really stop the raiding of the tribes. But then, relations between the Nawakiya and the Seljuk court deteriorated. The Seljuk court, always fearful of the tribes and in particular fearful of the Nawakiya Confederation, appears to have tried to arrest several leaders of the Nawakiya. These leaders, including the key leader Erbasgan, were in fact princes of the House of Seljuk, which was part of what made Alp Arslan so apprehensive about this powerful confederation of wild tribesmen. The fear that perhaps a Seljuk prince could capitalize upon distaste among the tribes with the ever-cooking court and use their support to try to overthrow him. This led Erbasgan to flee to Constantinople, seeking an alliance with the Emperor of the Romans, which Romanos fatefully agreed to. This alliance then, predictably, caused Alp Arslan to totally flip out. He decided that this frontier zone where the three empires met had to be controlled, and that the Nawakiya and the Shia emirs of Aleppo had to be brought into line. He assembled a great army, rode into Syria, and forced the emirs of Aleppo to submit. Along the way, he had conquered the Roman garrison city of Manzikert, a warning to the emperor about making alliances with Turkmen rebels. When news of this reached Constantinople, Romanos Theogenes assembled a massive army at a great strain to his weakened state's budget. He marched east to retake Manzikert. But in a campaign riddled with errors, his great army was ultimately destroyed by Alp Arslan and the Seljuks on the plains in front of Manzikert. The emperor was taken captive, and the gates of Anatolia were thrown open to the Turks, which is where we left things off. Now, to understand why Manzikert ultimately resulted in waves of Turkish migration into Anatolia, we need to look at what was happening in both the lands of the Seljuk Empire and in Byzantium. See, mass migration always and everywhere has both push and pull factors. Things driving the migrants out of where they currently are, and things pulling them to where they're going. Think about Irish immigration to America in the 19th century. The push factors were the great famines in Ireland and English political oppression. The pull factors were the abundance of the American economy and America's less oppressive political culture. Or think of the recent wave of Syrian migration to Turkey and Europe. The push factor is the civil war devastating the country. The pull factor is the public safety and higher earning potential in Turkey and the EU. Well, this was just as true in the past. Migration, then as now, happened due to push and pull factors. And we've already covered the push factors for Turkish migration in our prior episodes. Alp Arslan's victory in Syria and Manzikert itself had brought that border zone, the zone of instability in northern Syria and southern Anatolia, firmly into the Seljuk Empire. And the years after Alp Arslan's death, shortly after Manzikert, saw the rise of Nizam-ul-Mulk and al-Dawla al-Nizamiya. And Nizam-ul-Mulk, of course, detested the tribes and the Turkish chieftains. This caused immense tension between the court and the tribes, just as the former frontier zone of northern Syria, where the Nawakiya and the other tribes had flourished, was brought under the control of the court. Thus, during al-Dawla al-Nizamiya, the Seljuk court became increasingly powerful and increasingly cooked, increasingly Persian, and the lands of the Central Empire became politically uncomfortable to the wild tribes. And so they began to leave, pushing out beyond the frontiers of the empire. As we discussed in our earlier episodes, some of the Nawakiya left northern Syria, moving south. There they formed the Nawakiya Beylik in the Levant, which of course ultimately invaded Fatimid Egypt under Atsuz, leading to catastrophe and the Beylik being gobbled up by the Seljuk court. But far, far larger numbers left Syria to the north, flooding into Anatolia. There they were joined by other tribes from the east, from Azerbaijan and Iran, tribes also coming into increasing tension with al-Dawla al-Nizamiya. So what were the pull factors? Why Anatolia in particular? What made Anatolia more attractive than, say, the Levant or Egypt to larger numbers of Turkmen? Well, there were a couple of things, some political and some economic or ecological. To start with, Anatolia, and in particular the plateau, just so happened to be perfectly suited to the nomadic way of life from a purely ecological and economic perspective. The land is predominantly grasslands, providing ample pasturage for the herds. And due to the elevation, the climate is substantially cooler than the desert lands of Syria and the Levant. A welcome change for men and beasts, generally more accustomed to the cooler climates of Central Asia and the Iranian plateau. And from a broader economic perspective, in addition to grasslands, the plateau also contains areas with arable farmland and was dotted with settlements of varying sizes, everything from tiny villages up through large cities. Indeed, some of the oldest and largest cities in the world at the time. Remember, nomadic peoples always exist in concert with their settled neighbors. They depend upon extracting resources from the settled world through a combination of commerce and warfare. So the presence of cities and farmers in extremely close proximity to excellent pasturage lands provided the tribes with both trading partners and targets for raiding. In short, the land was such a good fit for the nomadic lifestyle that it seems to have almost been designed for Turkish settlement. But on an even more immediate level, there was another pull factor. The total collapse of the Roman state in large swaths of Anatolia and the inability of the Byzantines to stop the Turks. In essence, the dissolution of the Roman state in eastern Anatolia, and indeed in large parts of the plateau, even in the west. Civil war and disorder in the settled world are always a pull factor for nomads. And we've already seen in earlier episodes of the podcast how civil war, disorder, or even just weakness in China or Iran would draw the tribes from the periphery inwards, like a magnet. The tribes would take advantage of civil war to both graze their herds, pillage and plunder, and to take sides in the war itself. And so it would be in Anatolia. Now the tribes had earlier raided deep into Anatolia, but always the Roman state would push them out. The Romans would essentially assemble an eastern army every year, and even if that army didn't defeat the Turks in the field, its presence and the power of the Roman state was enough to force them to return east eventually. But in doing this, the empire was forced to rely on Latin and Pecheneg mercenaries, which resulted in fraying imperial control over much of Anatolia. And then, even that frayed and tattered imperial control totally collapsed after Manzikert, as civil war and disorder erupted in Byzantium. Now, this is not a Byzantine history podcast. Indeed, if you're interested, I would highly recommend the very famous History of Byzantium podcast. But we need to understand the effects of Manzikert within the Roman Empire in order to understand the migration of the Turks into Anatolia. So I'm going to do a brief rundown of the immediate effects of the Great Defeat within the Roman Empire, and I'm not going to be going into great detail here. I'm just going to focus on what is necessary to understand the Turkish story. Okay, so what happened in Byzantium after Manzikert? Predictably, the result was civil war. Romanos rode back west as a severely weakened emperor. The eastern armies of the empire had been destroyed, and he himself had been captured by Alp Arslan. According to both Byzantine and Muslim historians, as part of his release, he had been forced to agree to pay tribute to the Seljuks, which would have been a totally normal and expected thing following such a heavy defeat and his own capture. This was seized upon by the emperor's enemies at court, who proclaimed this to be unacceptable, and were soon conspiring to get rid of the emperor. The opposition faction coalesced around Michael Ducas, a member of the powerful Ducas family. And if you'll recall, it had been another Ducas, Andronikos Ducas, who had led the rearguard at Manzikert and basically betrayed Romanos. On the 1st of October, 1071, just a few months after Manzikert, Michael Ducas declared himself to be the emperor in Constantinople. The Empress Eudokia would shortly be deposed and sent to a monastery. Romanos himself made for Tokat after Manzikert, just to the north of Sivas. What was left of the eastern armies seemed to have actually remained loyal to him, though their numbers were greatly reduced. Tellingly, the Turks seemed to have stuck to their side of the deal, and he was not attacked by Turkish bands. Indeed, Alp Arslan likely wanted to keep Romanos on the throne. In Tokat, Romanos tried to organize something of a defense of the heartland of the empire and indeed of his throne with what few resources he still had. When he heard the news from Constantinople about his deposition, his worst fears were confirmed, and of course, he just could not accept this. So he started assembling an army, and in the process using up troops who otherwise would have been organized to stand against the Turks. According to Michael Ataliates, he even gained the support of Turkish troops in the coming civil war. The Turks, it seems, were already jumping right into the middle of Byzantine politics. Romanos marched south out of Tokat, linking up with troops from Cilicia, which remained loyal to him. Indeed, the Byzantine commander in Cilicia was well on his way to essentially setting up his own principality in the south, one that would pay mere lip service to Constantinople. Thus reinforced, Emperor Romanos began marching west, eventually coming into Cappadocia. Meanwhile, John Ducas, a powerful noble and the brother of the new Emperor Michael Ducas, and his son Andronikos, marched an army out of Constantinople and across Anatolia, drawing away from their posts many of the remaining Byzantine troops on the plateau. Disturbingly, they were already facing constant assaults by Turkish raiders, even in the west of Anatolia. The armies of Romanos and the Dukai met in the field somewhere in Cappadocia, according to Michael Ataliates, and Romanos' forces were routed. He and his army retreated to a small fortress named Tyropaion, where they faced further defeat. Running out of options, Romanos fled to Cilicia, hoping to winter in Adana with the Dukai fast on his heels. But when the remnants of his forces straggled into Adana, the garrison decided that there was no point in sticking with such a beaten emperor. And so Romanos was turned over to the Dukai and made a captive for the second time in his career as an emperor. Though his personal safety had supposedly been guaranteed, he must have known that this was not going to end well. According to Matthew of Edessa, Emperor Romanos Theogenes said to Andronicus Ducas, the man who had betrayed him at Manzikert, "You need no longer bother about me, since hereafter I wish to live in a monastery with clerics. Let Michael be your emperor, and may God be with him." He was, of course, instead betrayed and blinded. He died from the pain and severity of his wounds. And so, rather tragically, thus passed the man who had lost at Manzikert. Michael Ducas was thus secured on his throne in Constantinople for now. But at the same time, the empire was facing revolt and invasion everywhere. The news of Manzikert, the civil war, and the invasions of the Turks had traveled far and emboldened the enemies of the empire in the west. In the Balkans, a great revolt of the Bulgarians began, led by a Bulgarian aristocrat. And in Italy, the Normans, under the fearsome Robert Guiscard, took the last of the Byzantine possessions in Italy and began ominously eyeing the Balkans. Emperor Michael was forced to send a large army west under the great general Nikephoros Vrienios, who we last saw at Manzikert. This, of course, limited the response that Michael could take in Anatolia. The troops just weren't there. But he was not blind to the threat posed by the Turks. Constantinople was not completely out to lunch. As Anatolia descended into anarchy over 1071 and 1072, Emperor Michael did begin to plan to do something about it. And so, in spring 1073, a great Byzantine army was assembled in Constantinople to march east and drive the Turks out. The army was placed under the command of Isaac Komnenos, the brother of the future emperor Alexios. Isaac marched his army east to Kayseri, where he suffered a grievous defeat at the hands of the Turks. Unfortunately for the Romans, he seems to have just totally bungled the campaign. Michael Attaliates writes that Isaac Komnenos decided to charge the enemy Turks and join battle with them, so he set out at night with a portion of his army. Failing, however, in his plans, he suffered the exact opposite of what he had anticipated, finding himself unprepared before an enemy that expected him, and thus fighting a battle he had not hoped for. He was defeated, overwhelmed by the greater numbers of the enemy. Isaac's army was destroyed by the Turks, and he himself was taken captive. Reportedly, the future Emperor Alexios chased the Turks northwest as far as Ankara, trying to get his brother back. There, a huge ransom was paid to the Turks, and Isaac was released. But this did nothing to assuage the defeat the Romans had suffered. Never again would a Roman army march as far east as Kayseri, what had traditionally been the staging point for Roman campaigns to the east for centuries. The two Komnenos brothers then escaped to the northwest, but were ambushed by 200 Turks near Izmit, less than a day's ride from Constantinople's Asian suburbs. A shocking indication of how far Turkish raiding now reached. The Roman state had lost the ability to defend even the doorstep of the great city. As Michael Attaliates writes, as for the Turks, from that time they began to raid the east without any fear. Maybe even more than Manzikert, it was this defeat that fundamentally broke Roman rule in the east of Anatolia. Outside of the coastlines and the west of the plateau, the Roman state effectively began to evaporate. And even where the Byzantine state still existed, Turkish raiders could still strike, even less than a day's ride from the capital. It was in this environment of collapse that yet another blow fell on the Roman state. The Norman general Roussel de Bayeux, who we last saw being defeated by Alp Arslan before Manzikert, then revolted. Roussel and his company of 400 Latin knights had been ordered to march with Isaac to the east, but appear to have broken off from the army before its destruction. He and his men marched north, where Roussel set himself up in Ankara, and began making alliances with bands of Turkish raiders in the process. In order to defeat Roussel, Emperor Michael ordered his cousin John Ducas to march out and defeat the rebel Norman. Yet this ended in catastrophe for Byzantium yet again. The Roman army was broken in a crushing defeat, and John Ducas himself was captured. Emboldened, Roussel de Bayeux marched on Constantinople, coming to the Asian suburbs of Üsküdar in 1074. Yet in a shocking turn of events, and one that demonstrates just how completely the Turks had overrun Anatolia, Roussel de Bayeux was soon defeated by a Turkish warband on the shores of the Bosphorus itself. According to the son of Nikephoros Vrienios, a historian called Vrienios the Younger, and most historians, this raiding party was led by none other than Artuk, the progenitor of what will come to be the Artukid Beylik in southeastern Turkey, and the man we last saw as the ally of Tutush in Syria in our episode on the Seljuk collapse. Artuk then appears to have held Roussel for ransom, which itself is interesting, as it implies that he had no grander political ambitions than the extraction of plunder. The Byzantine court sent Alexios Komnenos out with the ransom, but Roussel's wife got there first. She offered a larger sum to Artuk, who promptly released the rebellious Norman to her. Roussel then escaped off to north-central Anatolia, making his base in Amasya. There, he began setting up his own little kingdom, relying on both Norman knights and the Turkish newcomers. In a preview of what's going to happen throughout Anatolia, the local people actually appreciated the ability of Roussel and his men to provide order. And in another preview of what's to come, fearful of Roussel de Bayeux, the imperial government in Constantinople reached out to the Turks to provide a counterweight, thus entrenching Turkish presence in Anatolia. It wasn't until 1075 that Roussel would be captured by Alexios, and even then, it required a ploy and, reportedly, the cooperation of a Turkish chieftain. Even here, the Romans were becoming reliant on Turkish military muscle. Thus, through the civil wars and the failed attempts against the Turks and the war with Roussel de Bayeux, the eastern frontiers of the empire were denuded of troops. Virtually no Roman garrisons were left in the entirety of the plateau, and the mercenaries the Byzantines had depended upon prior to Manzikert were now also gone. Turkish bands rampaged across the entirety of Anatolia, even up to the suburbs of Constantinople itself. There was nowhere safe from the Turks. Anatolia was lost. There was now no one who could stop Turkish raiders and indeed migrants. And so, the tribes rushed into Anatolia as the Roman military apparatus, in essence, evaporated. Part of what contributed to the problem for the Romans was that the focus of the Byzantine elites was not on the eastern frontier and the total collapse of Roman authority in Anatolia. It was far closer to home, on who would succeed in Constantinople. Indeed, it is quite telling how little attention Michael Attaliates actually gives to the details of the Turkish invasion. He is much more concerned about the internal goings-on at court and the struggles for the throne. The Turkish invasion is really just a backdrop to this for him, and he mentions the Turks only insofar as they interact with the Byzantine elites and influence the civil war and the struggles for the throne. The other great contemporary or near-contemporary Byzantine works also don't really focus on the details. Nikephoros Votaniatis, the coming emperor, is mostly concerned with using the Turks as sort of a moral lesson, something demonstrating how bad and incompetent Romanos and the Dukids are, and justifying his attempts to seize power. And the great historian Anna Komnena, the daughter of Alexios, writing decades later, is of course mostly interested in justifying her father's rise to power, and so she presents the Turks as simultaneously an invincible force that her father could never have defeated, and as a sort of morality tale, blackening the name of his predecessors, whose mess he was forced to clean up, according to her. So she is also completely uninterested in the details of the Turks. All of this suggests the extent to which the Byzantine elite were blind to the danger posed by Turkish migration. The fact that they don't really write in detail about the most important thing happening to their empire really seems to demonstrate both that they did not appreciate how permanent Turkish presence would be, or how much of a threat Turkish migration, and more importantly Turkish military power, posed to Roman rule in Anatolia. But this leaves us with a problem, because unfortunately, the Muslim historians also do not provide us with great details about the initial Turkish invasions immediately following Manzikert. As I said in our prior episodes, the Muslim authors are mostly Persians and Arabs, who are largely uninterested in the tribal Turks. Like the Byzantine authors, they write about the internal drama at court. Their works are focused on what's happening in the Seljuk Muasker, and in Baghdad and Esfahan. And remember, the wild tribes who invaded Anatolia were actually largely outside of the control of the Seljuk court, especially as the court became increasingly cooked during al-Dawla al-Nizamiya. So the Muslim historians themselves don't really have a good view into what happened either. And thus, we are left with very few written sources that we can trust about how the initial invasions happened, and how Turkish migration onto the plateau began immediately after Manzikert. Basically, our sources are pretty shaky for like the first decade or so of the migrations, and in particular, for the initial 2 to 3 years after Manzikert. After that, as Turkish power consolidates and a state-building project begins in Anatolia itself, our sources of course get a lot better. But unfortunately, we're a bit limited in explaining the immediate aftermath of Manzikert. Additionally, the later Seljuk sources are of course written from a biased perspective. They are written with the intent of legitimizing the conquests and the Turkish dynasties that would soon emerge. This means that they both want to provide a good reason for the conquest taking place, and more importantly, they constantly try to play up the role of the emirs, the beys, and the princes to the story. In particular, they play up the line of Kutalmış, the coming Seljuk sultans of Rum. They want to make the rise of the Sultanate look inevitable, and the princes and emirs as crucial to the story. And furthermore, they want to make all of this look halal from a Perso-Islamic perspective. That is, ordained by God and the Sultan. There is one Seljuk source, the Seljuk Name, written by the historian Nishapuri, which includes an interesting anecdote. It relates that Alparslan ordered the invasion of Byzantine Anatolia after the Romans ceased to pay tribute as agreed following Manzikert. He writes, "When the king of the Romans reached his own territory, the Satan of disappointment entered his heart, and the demon of temptation his brain. And so he showed deficiency and delay in the sending of tribute to the treasury. When they revealed this state of affairs to His Majesty the Sultan, he ordered the emirs to invade the provinces of the Romans. Each district they were to conquer and take possession of would belong to him and his children and grandchildren. Except for him, nobody would have access or control over it." And as we can see, this is clearly written to justify the rule of the various Turkish Beyliks and realms that would come to exist in Anatolia. It positions their foundation not as the activities of wild tribesmen carving out their own realms, but rather as gifts of the Sultan. In other words, as legitimate forms of government, not just rampaging tribes of Turks. But this is profoundly not what actually happened. The Turkish invasions and migrations were not top-down affairs directed by the sultans or even really directed by the emirs and the beys. These were not invasions led by the line of Kutalmış or organized by the Seljuk court. They were instead bottom-up affairs, with the tribes themselves invading by their own will. They were conducted by various small bands and tribes operating essentially independently, and it was only after these invasions and migrations that the various principalities and beyliks came into existence. Contrary to what the Islamic histories would have you believe, the establishment of the Sultanate of Rum and the Beyliks arose not before the migrations, but really after them. So what can we say about the initial Turkish movement into Anatolia? Based on what we do know, it seems that the Turkish invasions and migrations began immediately after Manzikert. As news filtered back to northern Syria of the great Seljuk victory over the Romans, the capture of the emperor, and the subsequent collapse of the Roman frontier, the tribes surged north from Syria. Soon they were joined by other tribes from Azerbaijan and Iran. The tribes moved into land recently vacated by the Roman troops. The evidence indicates that they moved in relatively small bands. Ibn al-Athir, for example, tells us that one group of Iraqi Turkmen numbered 2,000 tents, which the historian Alexander Byhammer says means approximately 8,000 to 10,000 people, including women and children. Ibn al-Athir also mentions another band of Turkmen constituting 3,000 to 5,000 warriors. So these bands were not quite tiny forces, but they also weren't huge armies. And as always, they traveled with their herds, their women, and their children. A whole people on the move. And so these small bands of Turks spread rapidly through basically the entirety of the plateau. Wherever there were not Roman soldiers or mercenaries to stop them, they advanced. And as there were basically no soldiers anywhere on the plateau itself, the advance of these small bands of Turks could not be stopped. As they spread across the plateau, they grazed their herds through the grasslands, coming into contact and conflict with the settled farmers, though we don't have specific accounts to rely upon. Additionally, they would partake in the other great pastime of nomadic invaders, which is, of course, raiding the settled peoples. Again, we don't really have sources speaking to specific incidents here, but the Roman authors do sort of give a picture of general despoilment. For example, Vranios the Younger writes in his history that the Turks began to pillage the east shortly after Manzikert. And we have reports of raids occurring across Anatolia, even where the Byzantine state and military apparatus didn't totally collapse. In short, it seems that Anatolia, and in particular the east, in essence fell into anarchy. With the Roman state evaporating, the region basically descended into a patchwork of city-states, with the local Byzantine nobility and what remained of the local military hiding behind their walls and desperately trying to save themselves and their cities from the rampages of the Turks. And this, ultimately, would lead to something far more important to our story: the coming establishment of Turkish Beyliks in Anatolia. Because of course, as small bands of Turkmen raided across Anatolia, some of the leaders of these bands and the local settled nobility started reaching out to each other. And as happens so often, the leadership of some of the tribes began to offer their assistance to the settled nobles for a price. Pay us tribute, and we'll protect you from other bands of Turks. In essence, this was a form of a mafia-style protection racket. And in some places, the local nobility invited bands of Turks in, seeing them as the only way to protect their cities and estates from other Turks. These relationships were, in many ways, similar to those that the Turks had experience of back in Iran and Iraq and Khorasan. Think of the origins of the Seljuk Empire. Indeed, these sorts of transactional relationships between the tribes and the local elites have been with us since the start of the podcast, going all the way back to the tribes of northern China. Well, now a similar thing is going to happen here, but with Byzantine nobles and Turkish nomads. And as we will discuss next time, these arrangements will ultimately form the nuclei of the coming Beyliks and indeed the Sultanate of Rum. Because the Turkish leadership would eventually come to move into these cities as the tribes continued to roam through the countryside. There, they would form deeper and longer relationships with the local elites, as these protection arrangements would come to evolve into actual Turkish political entities, Beyliks, and even a sultanate. In time, nascent courts would emerge in these cities as the Turkish elites moved in. In fact, replicating in miniature the process by which the great Seljuk sultans had created semi-Persian style courts in Iran, but now built on top of the pre-existing Roman political structures. And so next time, we will discuss the emergence of the Anatolian Beyliks after the Roman attempts to retake Anatolia fail, and the line of Kutalmış, so long denied the Sultanate, will finally get its due and establish the next great Turkish state, the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum.